The year was 1862, and New York City was a symphony of chaos and ambition. The cobblestone streets of the Lower East Side, slick with a perpetual film of grime and horse-drawn carriage exhaust, were a far cry from the manicured avenues of the city's elite. Here, amidst the clamor, Elias Thorne ran his photography studio. At 40 years old, a widower for 5 years, he was a man defined by meticulousness and an almost painful introversion. His studio, with its heavy velvet drapes, polished mahogany furnishings, and the faint, acrid smell of developing chemicals, was his sanctuary, a world he could control, unlike the one he had lost. Elias was a portraitist, but not a flamboyant one. He didn't capture fleeting smiles or theatrical poses. He sought something deeper, something honest in the gaze of his subjects. His camera, a heavy brass and wood box on a tripod, was his confidant. He believed it could see truths the human eye often missed. It was a cold November afternoon when the Blackwood's summons arrived. The invitation, delivered by a liveried servant, was simple, but its embossed crest of a raven holding a key spoke volumes. Alistair and Eleanor Blackwood. The names were synonymous with wealth and influence, a world Elias only glimpsed from a distance. The request was unusual, not just a portrait, but a piece of art that would capture the essence of their union, not just their likeness. The retainer, a sum that could keep his studio running for a year, was an offer he couldn't refuse. The following day, Elias found himself standing before the Blackwood mansion on Fifth Avenue. It was an imposing structure of dark brownstone, its windows like watchful, hollow eyes. The air here was different, thinner, scented with cut flowers and money. A butler with a face as impassive as stone led him into a cavernous parlor. The room was a museum of opulence, heavy drapes, ornate furniture, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors watching from the walls. Alistair Blackwood was the first to greet him. He was a man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a dark suit. His handshake was firm, almost aggressive, and his eyes, a sharp and calculating grey, seemed to assess Elias not as an artist, but as a tool. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We appreciate your punctuality. My wife and I are told you have a unique eye for detail. We require that eye today." Eleanor Blackwood entered the room moments later. She was a striking woman, younger than her husband by at least a decade, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and a complexion as pale as marble. Her dress, a silk gown the color of twilight, seemed to absorb the light around her. But it was her eyes that held Elias's attention. They were a deep, unsettling brown, and as she looked at him, he saw a flicker of something he couldn't name. Was it fear, or a cold, brittle determination? When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost a whisper, a stark contrast to her husband's booming presence. "Mr. Thorne, it is a pleasure. Alistair speaks highly of your work." Alistair placed a possessive hand on her shoulder, a gesture that seemed both protective and restraining. "Eleanor is delicate," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "She prefers quiet moments. You will find her a fascinating subject." Elias set up his camera, feeling the weight of the moment. He chose a spot near a large bay window, the soft winter light bathing the room. Alistair positioned himself behind Eleanor's chair, his hand still on her shoulder, his expression one of proud possession. Eleanor sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on a point just past Elias's shoulder, 1,000,000 miles away. He spent the next hour making small adjustments, trying to capture something genuine from them. He asked them to look at each other, to share a small moment of intimacy. Alistair's expression remained a mask of controlled affection. Eleanor's, however, was a study in contrast. When she looked at him, her eyes held a flicker of something Elias interpreted as a plea, a silent message hidden behind the veneer of a devoted wife. He took a series of exposures, each one a careful, deliberate act. The chemical-coated glass plates captured the light, the shadows, and the subtle, unspoken tension in the room. He felt a growing unease, a sense that something was deeply wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not just taking a picture, he was documenting a silent struggle. One particular shot stood out. Alistair was leaning in slightly, his face close to Eleanor's, a look of proprietorial ownership in his eyes. Eleanor, in turn, was looking at the camera, but her face was turned slightly, and in a mirror on the wall behind them, her reflection was caught. It was a fleeting image, but Elias felt a jolt of recognition. The reflection in the mirror seemed to hold a different expression, a hint of panic, a momentary break in her controlled demeanor. He packed up his equipment, the silence of the room now heavy with unspoken things. Alistair paid him, his words of thanks sounding hollow. Eleanor gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod as he left, a gesture that he couldn't decipher, but that resonated with him. Back in his own world, the memory of her eyes lingered. In his studio, the scent of chemicals was a welcome familiarity. He placed the glass plates in the developing bath. The images slowly began to emerge, dark shapes forming on the glass. He held the first plate up to the light, a shot of Alistair and Eleanor sitting together. The image was a masterpiece of composition, but it was also a lie. It was a perfect, beautiful lie. He took out his magnifying glass, a tool he used to check for imperfections, and began to scrutinize the plates. He started with the one where Eleanor's reflection was visible. He moved the glass over her image, examining the fine details of her dress, the way the light caught her hair. Then he moved the lens over the mirror's reflection. He zoomed in, his eye pressed against the cold brass of the magnifier. He saw the distortion he had noticed, but it was more than just a trick of light. In the mirror, partially obscured by the frame but visible enough to send a chill down his spine, was the faint, almost ghostly outline of a hand. A large, rough hand with a distinctive ring on the index finger. It was not Eleanor's hand. It was Alistair's, placed on the back of her chair, a gesture he had hidden from the camera's direct view. But the reflection showed a different story. A hand not of affection, but of command. Elias's pulse quickened. He moved to the next plate, a close-up of Alistair's confident smile. He zoomed in on his subject, looking at the details of his cravat, his jacket. He focused on the gold pin on his lapel, a small raven, the same as the crest on the invitation. Then, he moved the magnifier down to Alistair's waistcoat, and his gaze fixed on a small glint of silver. It was a watch chain, and attached to it was a small locket. Through his magnifying glass, he could see something truly bizarre. The locket was ajar, ever so slightly, and from within its tiny opening, a wisp of a dark hair was caught, barely visible to the naked eye. Elias sat back in his chair, the magnifying glass clutched in his hand. The portraits, meant to be a testament to a perfect union, were instead revealing something insidious. The silent tension he had felt in that grand parlor was not a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was captured on his plates. The Blackwoods were not a happy couple. They were keepers of a dark secret, a truth so well hidden that only the cold, unblinking eye of a camera and the meticulous gaze of a lonely photographer could expose it. He was now a witness to something he wasn't supposed to see, and a terrifying thought took root in his mind. Was he just an observer, or was he now a part of their dark story? Elias Thorne sat in the stillness of his studio, the chemical smell of phantom limb he could no longer feel. The two developed glass plates lay on his desk, bathed in the soft glow of a gas lamp. He had been staring at them for hours, the details he'd uncovered through his magnifying glass, burning themselves into his mind. The subtle, possessive grip of Alistair Blackwood's hand, the single wisp of dark hair caught in the locket. They were not mere imperfections. They were threads in a tapestry of deceit, woven so tightly that they were invisible to the naked eye. But Elias's eye was not naked. It was aided by a lens, and that lens had shown him a truth he was now morally bound to explore. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the hand was just a trick of the light, the wisp of hair a stray thread. But a photographer, like a detective, learns to trust his instincts, and his instincts screamed that this was no accident. The tension he had felt in that parlor, the cold determination in Eleanor's eyes, the way she seemed to be both in control and completely helpless, it all pointed to a carefully constructed facade. A facade so perfect it would crumble only under the most intense scrutiny. The night air outside his studio was frigid, the sounds of the city muffled by the hour. Elias pulled on his coat, an old, heavy garment that had seen him through many lonely winters. He knew he couldn't stay here staring at the pictures. He needed to move, to act. He needed to understand who the Blackwoods truly were. His first thought was to go to the newspapers, but he knew that would be a dead end. Alistair Blackwood's influence was too great. A story without concrete evidence would be dismissed as a fantasy, and Elias would be left a laughingstock, or worse. He had to be smarter, more patient. His investigation began with the simple act of walking. He sought out the places where information, like water, tended to pool. The local taverns, where gossip flowed freely with the ale. The public library on Astor Place, its shelves a repository of old newspapers and directories. He spent the next few days in a quiet, relentless pursuit, a shadow among shadows. He posed as a genealogist, a historical researcher, a man simply curious about the city's prominent families. At the library, he found old articles detailing Alistair Blackwood's rise. The narrative was one of a self-made man, a visionary businessman who had turned a small trading post into a sprawling empire. But in the fine print, in the archives of lesser-known periodicals, Elias found whispers of a darker side. A business partner, a man named Thomas Price, who had been instrumental in Blackwood's early success, had vanished without a trace just before a major merger. The case had been closed, ruled as a voluntary departure, but the language of the articles hinted at skepticism. Thomas Price had a wife and 2 small children. He had left everything behind, his life, his savings, and his family. The official story simply didn't ring true. Elias delved into Eleanor Blackwood's past. It was harder to find information on her. She was a woman of mystery, a sudden, almost phantom-like presence in Alistair's life. He learned she was the daughter of a minor merchant, a family that had fallen on hard times. Her marriage to Alistair had been a social sensation, a dramatic leap from a life of quiet hardship to one of unimaginable luxury. But the articles never spoke of her personality, her passions, her history before the marriage. She was simply a beautiful, silent object to be admired. This lack of information was, in itself, a chilling clue. It was as if she had not existed before she married Alistair. The wisp of hair in the locket gnawed at him. He couldn't place its owner. It was a dark strand, and Eleanor's hair was dark, but so was the hair of thousands of women in the city. The detail was too small, too mundane to be significant on its own. It was a key without a lock, a final piece of a puzzle he didn't yet have. As he walked back to his studio one evening, the gas lamps casting long, dancing shadows on the wet streets, a shiver of unease ran down his spine. He had the distinct, visceral sensation of being watched. He turned, his gaze sweeping the street behind him. A figure, shrouded in a dark coat, was standing in the doorway of a closed shop. When Elias met his gaze, the figure quickly stepped back into the shadows. Elias quickened his pace, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. It was a man, and he knew he wasn't a coincidence. He had been found. Back in his studio, the feeling of vulnerability was suffocating. He locked the door, but he knew it was a useless gesture. Alistair Blackwood was not a man who respected locked doors. He was a man who owned the keys. The following day, he returned to the archives, more cautious now, more aware of his surroundings. He was no longer a curious photographer. He was a man in danger. He decided to focus on the period just before the Blackwoods' marriage. He sifted through old city records, social columns, and police reports. And there, buried in the back pages of a small community newspaper from the spring of 1861, he found it. The headline was simple: "Maid disappears from Blackwood household." The article described the disappearance of a young woman named Clara, who had been employed as a maid for the Blackwoods. The police had investigated but, as with the Thomas Price case, had found no evidence of foul play and had concluded she had simply run away. The article included a brief description of her and a small, grainy photograph. Elias's breath hitched. He squinted at the image. The photo was faded, but he could make out a young woman with a kind face and dark, wavy hair, pulled back into a simple bun. It was the hairstyle of a servant, but it was also the precise color and texture of the hair in the locket. He felt a profound sense of certainty. He was not just looking at a picture of a missing girl, he was looking at the answer to his question. The hair in the locket belonged to Clara. But why would Alistair keep such a thing? The implications were horrifying. He wasn't collecting mementos. He was collecting trophies. The story of a perfect couple had just been revealed as a story of a silent terror, and Elias was holding the first, terrifying page. The discovery of the newspaper clipping about Clara sent a jolt of ice through Elias. The wisp of hair in the locket was no longer a vague curiosity. It was a tangible link to a human life that had been erased. He was now pursuing not just a lie, but a tragedy. The weight of this knowledge pressed on his shoulders, making the air in his studio feel thick and heavy. He spent the next few days trying to find a record of Clara's family. He returned to the public library, sifting through census records and old city directories. The name Clara was common, but he finally found a promising lead. A record of a family named Miller, who had a daughter named Clara working in domestic service, and a second daughter, Sarah, who worked as a seamstress. The family's last known address was in a modest tenement in a crowded corner of the Lower East Side, not far from his own studio. He made the journey in the late afternoon, the city's usual clamor seeming more grating than usual. The tenement was a grim, soot-stained building, its windows like missing teeth. He found the Miller family's door on the third floor. He knocked, his heart thumping in a rhythm of fear and anticipation. The door was opened by a woman in her late 20s, her face etched with a fatigue that seemed older than her years. Her hands, nimble and calloused, were stained with the color of thread. She was Sarah Miller. Elias introduced himself, a photographer, and explained his search for her sister. Sarah's expression hardened. "We don't talk about Clara," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It's a finished matter. The police said she ran away. We accepted it and moved on." Elias knew he had to be careful. He couldn't reveal the full extent of his knowledge, not yet. He spoke of the Blackwoods, of his work, and of the unusual circumstances he had observed during his commission. He mentioned the newspaper article he had found and how it had sparked a personal curiosity he couldn't shake. He spoke with a quiet sincerity, a genuine empathy that seemed to chip away at her defenses. Sarah's eyes, a tired gray, finally met his. "He's a powerful man, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "My mother and father, they were terrified. They said we should forget she ever existed, but I couldn't." Tears welled up in her eyes, silent and swift. She invited him inside, the small room dominated by a sewing machine. She told him about Clara, her younger sister, bright and full of dreams. She had been so excited to work for the Blackwoods, to live in a grand house, to have a good life. But the letters she sent home began to change. They were less frequent, less cheerful. Clara spoke of a strange atmosphere in the house, a suffocating silence. In her final letter, sent just before her disappearance, she had mentioned Alistair Blackwood's obsessive control over the household, his raven's grip, as she called it. She also mentioned a secret room, a place she had accidentally stumbled upon in the mansion. The location, she wrote, was a place she felt she could hide things, but also a place where secrets were kept. "She sent me this," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she reached into a small wooden box. She pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a crude, hand-drawn sketch of a part of a floor plan. It was not a grand room, but a small, unmarked section tucked away with a prominent X marked on it. She wrote that she had found something she couldn't tell anyone, not even me, because of the risk. She said if anything ever happened to her, to give this to someone she could trust. She said she hid something there. Elias's heart pounded. This was more than a clue. It was a physical artifact, a tangible piece of evidence that could blow Alistair Blackwood's perfect life apart. The stakes had just been raised from a silent obsession to an active mission. He wasn't just a curious observer. He was a participant in a dangerous game. He thanked Sarah, his voice thick with emotion. He promised her he would find out what happened to Clara. As he left the tenement, a renewed sense of purpose hardened his resolve, but his triumph was short-lived. As he walked back to his studio, the feeling of being watched returned, more intense than before. He turned a corner and saw the same dark figure from the previous night, now closer, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. He was a stocky man with a menacing stoop. Elias ducked into a small alleyway, his mind racing. He heard footsteps behind him, but he was too fast. He cut through the alley, emerging on a different street, and sprinted the rest of the way to his studio, adrenaline a bitter taste on his tongue. He locked the door behind him and leaned against it, gasping for breath. The silence of his studio had never felt so precarious. He looked around his sanctuary, now a potential trap. The quiet safety he had cultivated for years had been shattered. He was now a target. The next morning, the proof of that danger was waiting for him. Tucked into the crack of his studio door, held in place by a jagged shard of glass from his own window, was a small, folded piece of paper. Elias's hands trembled as he unfolded it. The message was scrawled in a crude, spidery hand. It was just 2 words, but they were more terrifying than any threat he had ever heard. Stay away. The message was not just a warning, it was a confirmation. He was now a part of their story, a character in a drama he hadn't asked to join. He was no longer just a photographer of surfaces. He was a man with a target on his back, a fragile sheet of paper with a sketch of a secret room, and a moral obligation to a woman whose life had been erased by the power of a single malevolent man. He couldn't go to the police. He couldn't hide. He had to face the monster he had found in the portrait. He had to fight back. The note was a physical manifestation of his fear. Elias had faced grief, solitude, and the quiet struggle of his art, but he had never faced a direct malevolent threat. The thought of Alistair Blackwood's network, the enforcers, the hired thugs, chilled him to the bone. He knew he couldn't go on alone. The time for silent observation was over. He needed an ally, someone who was not only brave enough, but also smart enough to understand the gravity of the situation. His mind immediately went to Samuel Vance. Samuel was a journalist for one of the city's smaller, more progressive newspapers. He was a cynical, hard-drinking man with a sharp wit and an even sharper mind. He saw the city not through the gilded lens of high society, but through the grim reality of its back alleys and tenements. He and Elias had a strange but enduring friendship, built on mutual respect for each other's dedication to their craft and a shared contempt for the city's corrupt power structures. Elias went to the newspaper office, a chaotic, ink-stained hive of activity. He found Samuel at his desk, hunched over a cluttered pile of papers, a half-empty bottle of whiskey glinting under the gaslight. He looked up, his face a mess of stubble and exhaustion. "Elias," he grunted, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "What brings you to this asylum? Come to capture our grim faces for posterity?" Elias sat down, the chair creaking under his weight. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pulled out the glass plates and the 2 pieces of evidence he had gathered, the note and the sketch. He told Samuel the entire story, from the moment he received the Blackwoods commission to the chilling discovery of Clara's fate and the threatening note left on his door. Samuel listened, his expression shifting from one of cynical amusement to one of deep, unsettling seriousness. He held the magnifying glass to the plates, his breath a faint fog on the cold glass. He saw the hand in the mirror, the wisp of hair in the locket. He held the sketch, his brow furrowed in concentration. When Elias finished, Samuel leaned back in his chair, a low whistle escaping his lips. "Elias," he said, his voice quiet, "this is a hell of a story, a real-life Gothic novel. But it's not a story for a newspaper. Not yet. A man like Alistair Blackwood, he could have us both ruined. He could have us both dead." "I know," Elias said, his voice flat, "but I can't let it go. Clara, she deserves justice. I've seen what he is. I saw it in his eyes, in the way he looked at her, in the way he held her. It was possession, Samuel, not love. And I can't stand by and do nothing." Samuel stared at the sketch again, a newfound fire in his eyes. "All right, my friend," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm with you, but we do this my way. We don't go to the authorities, not yet. They would take Blackwood's word over ours. We have to find something undeniable, something that proves everything you've discovered, something that can't be explained away as a trick of the light or a flight of fancy." They spent the rest of the evening formulating a plan. They needed to find more information about Alistair Blackwood's past, particularly the mysterious disappearance of Thomas Price. They split the work. Samuel, with his contacts and his journalistic access, would dig into the financial records, the business deals, the rumors. Elias, with his meticulous eye and his quiet nature, would focus on the public records, the old directories, the archives. For the next week they worked in tandem, 2 shadows navigating the city's underbelly. Samuel uncovered a pattern of predatory business practices. Alistair Blackwood would invest in a company, gain control, and then, using a series of legal loopholes and veiled threats, would force the original owners out, leaving them destitute. The Thomas Price case was a perfect example. Alistair had seized control of Price's patents and, according to the records, the man had simply vanished. Elias in turn discovered a small, forgotten detail in a local historical society's archives. Thomas Price had a sister, a woman named Martha, who had been a vocal but ultimately powerless advocate for her brother after his disappearance. Her last known address was a small farm on the outskirts of the city. The next day, they traveled by horse-drawn carriage to a quiet, rural corner of Queens. They found Martha Price living in a small, dilapidated farmhouse. She was an old woman, her face a map of sorrow and resilience. She was initially wary of them, suspicious of their questions. "Everyone forgot about Thomas," she said, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. "The city just moved on. Alistair Blackwood. He has a way of making people disappear, not just from this earth, but from memory itself." Elias and Samuel explained their purpose, showing her the newspaper clippings, and speaking with a respectful empathy that finally broke through her reserve. Martha's eyes filled with tears as she looked at a photograph of her brother, a young man with a hopeful, kind face. He went to confront Alistair, she said, her voice filled with a desperate conviction. He had found something, evidence that Alistair was cheating his investors, his partners. He told me he was going to expose him. He even said he had hidden the proof in a safe in Alistair's office, a hidden safe. And then he was gone. He never came back. No one ever looked for him. Alistair said he was a coward, that he ran away with the money. Elias and Samuel exchanged a look. The secret room, the locket, the missing maid, the missing partner, the hidden safe. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place. Alistair Blackwood wasn't just a man who abused his power. He was a murderer. The truth they sought was not just hidden in a portrait, it was hidden in the walls of a mansion, and it had claimed more than one life. Their next step was clear and terrifying. They had to get back inside the Blackwood mansion. They had to find that safe. The idea of returning to the Blackwood mansion filled Elias with a cold dread. He was a man of quiet spaces and controlled environments. The thought of stepping back into that house, a place that now felt like a mausoleum of hidden secrets, made his hands tremble. But the discovery of Thomas Price's hidden safe and the chilling detail about the secret room from Clara's sketch had solidified their resolve. They had to get in. They couldn't simply break in. Alistair Blackwood was not only a man of influence, but also a man who valued security. The mansion was likely patrolled, its hidden cameras the watchful eyes of the city's power brokers. Their plan had to be a work of deception, a logical and believable ruse. "You have to go back as the photographer," Samuel said, his voice pragmatic. "It's the only way. He already knows you. It's the only role you can play convincingly. We'll create a reason for you to be there, one that he can't refuse." The plan they devised was audacious. Elias would contact the Blackwoods and claim that the glass plates from their initial session had a significant technical flaw. He would say that upon developing them, he had noticed a subtle distortion in the light, a barely perceptible imperfection that would mar the quality of the final prints. He would offer to retake the portraits, this time with a new, advanced process he was developing. Elias sat down to write the letter, his hand shaking. The lie had to be perfect. He used technical language, detailing the halation artifacts and the chromatic aberration that plagued the images. He ended the letter with a polite but firm insistence that for the sake of his professional reputation, he must be granted a second opportunity. He sent the letter by a private courier, a neutral party who would not raise Alistair's suspicions. Days passed with agonizing slowness. Elias was a prisoner in his own studio, constantly on edge. The feeling of being watched never left him. He saw a different man on his street corner every morning, pretending to be a simple laborer, but always watching his door. He knew Alistair had put him under surveillance. The threatening note was not an idle warning. Finally, the reply from Alistair Blackwood arrived. It was terse, a single sentence written in a sharp, elegant hand. "Come on Thursday at 2 o'clock. Do not be late." The tone was cold, the agreement devoid of any politeness. Elias knew what it meant. Alistair didn't believe his story. He was a master of manipulation, and he knew a lie when he heard one. He was allowing Elias back in not because he believed him, but because he wanted to see what he would do. He was playing a game of cat and mouse, and he was the cat. Elias and Samuel spent the next 2 days preparing. They meticulously studied the crude sketch of the mansion floor plan that Clara had provided. It was not a detailed blueprint, but it showed a section of the house that seemed to be a series of small connecting corridors, leading to the unmarked room with the X. They speculated it was a former service area, a forgotten part of the house. Elias's plan was to use his time inside to find that hidden room. He would need a pretext to move through the house without drawing Alistair's full attention. He decided to bring his most delicate and complex equipment, requiring several trips to and from the carriage. This would give him a brief window of opportunity. He also prepared a small portable camera, a new invention, a smaller, less conspicuous box with a simple lens. It was a risky move, but if he could get a picture of the secret room or the hidden safe, it could be the proof they needed. He practiced his movements, his excuses, his facial expressions. He had to appear calm, focused on his craft and completely oblivious to the danger he was in. The stakes were higher than ever. If he was caught, it would not be a matter of professional embarrassment. He would simply disappear, a name in another old newspaper clipping. His fate sealed by the same man whose face he had once so carefully captured on a glass plate. The night before the appointment, Elias lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The fear was a living thing in his chest, a tight knot of dread that he couldn't untangle. He thought of Clara, of Thomas Price, of all the silent victims of Alistair Blackwood's ambition. He thought of Eleanor, her eyes a mirror of her fear and her desire to break free. He was no longer doing this for himself, for some abstract sense of professional integrity. He was doing it for them. His purpose was now a shield against his fear. He was a photographer, a man of observation and light. And tomorrow, he would use his skills not to capture a lie, but to expose a terrible truth hidden in the darkest corner of a monster's house. He would face the raven in its lair, and he would either emerge with the evidence that would bring it down, or he would become just another one of its victims. Thursday arrived with a grey, ominous sky, mirroring the churning anxiety in Elias's stomach. The air was cold and biting, the kind of winter day that seemed to drain the life from the city. He rode in a hired carriage, his equipment carefully packed, a small portable camera hidden inside a false bottom of his main case. He felt like a soldier going to war, his camera, his only weapon. When he arrived at the Blackwood mansion, the immense front doors were opened by the same stone-faced butler. The air inside was still and heavy, devoid of the earlier tension he had felt. It was replaced with a different kind of silence, a cold, watchful one. Alistair Blackwood was waiting for him in the parlor, a glass of dark liquid in his hand. He was dressed in a pristine suit, every detail perfect, every line a testament to his control. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr. "I trust your technical difficulties have been resolved. We are a busy household, and I cannot afford to have my time wasted." Elias met his gaze, forcing himself to appear calm. "A complete resolution, Mr. Blackwood. I have discovered a more nuanced process that will capture the true essence of the scene. I believe the light and shadows were fighting against me during our last session. A new angle, a new approach is required." Alistair's eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to bore into his soul. "An artist's temperament, I see. Very well. Let us not keep my wife waiting." Eleanor entered the room, and Elias's heart gave a lurch. She looked even more frail than before, her skin translucent, her eyes sunken. But when she caught his gaze, there was a flicker of something different. It was not fear. It was a silent, desperate question. She seemed to be asking if he had understood her signal, her silent plea. He gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of reassurance that only a man of observation could have made. Elias began to set up his equipment, taking his time, as if in a daze of professional concentration. He feigned a minor problem with the bellows of his camera, making a show of a frantic, fumbling adjustment. This was his pretext. "1,000 apologies, Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "The bellows, they seem to be catching. I must have left a small tool in the carriage. It will only be a moment. I do apologize for the inconvenience." Alistair's smile was a cruel, thin line. "Then do not waste another. I shall be here." Elias hurried out, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He walked past the butler, who watched him with impassive eyes. He made his way to the front door, feigned a frantic search in his carriage. Then, as he came back, he veered off. He was in the lion's den, and the lion's eyes were on him, but he had a brief, precious window of opportunity. Using the sketch from Clara as a guide, he moved with the speed of a man possessed. He went down a service corridor that was dark and smelled of disuse. He found a small, narrow passage that was not on the main floor plan, hidden behind a large tapestry. He pulled it back. There was a door, its wood old and warped. It had no handle, only a small keyhole. He tried the knob, which was simply an iron disc, and found it locked. He felt a surge of panic. Had he been wrong? Was the key in the mansion after all? He heard footsteps, and his heart leaped into his throat. He just had time to duck back behind the tapestry as a figure passed him. It was one of Alistair's burly enforcers, a man with a brutish face and a swaggering gait. The man stopped, his gaze falling on the tapestry, as if he knew something was amiss. Elias held his breath, a statue in the shadows. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the man continued on his way. Elias realized he was not going to get the key from Eleanor. He had to think fast. He saw a small, rusted hinge on the door. It was old, and he realized he might be able to force it open with a small, flat piece of metal he had brought with him, a tool he used for his camera equipment. He worked in a frenzy, his hands shaking, a fine layer of sweat on his brow. The metal grated against the rusted hinge, and with a soft, protesting groan, the door gave way. He slipped inside the room, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. It was a small, windowless space. A single small gas lamp stood on a crate, casting long, dancing shadows. In the corner, a large, heavy chest sat, its dark wood worn and scuffed. Next to it was a pile of old, dirty clothes, and on the floor, a few inches from the chest, a glint of silver, a small, engraved locket. He took out his hidden camera, his hands still shaking, and quickly took several exposures. He got a shot of the room, the chest, the pile of clothes. He took a close-up of the locket on the floor, its inscription a blurred C for Clara, and then he saw it. A dark, dried stain on the wood of the chest. It was a large, dark smear. He took one more picture, a final, desperate act of documentation. He heard the sound of Alistair's voice from the other end of the corridor, his tone impatient and sharp. Elias knew his time was up. He slipped out, careful to close the door and push the tapestry back into place. He managed to return to the parlor just as Alistair was beginning to walk towards the front door. "Mr. Thorne, I must say your preparation is lacking," Alistair said, his voice cold. "It seems a shame to waste my time on such a simple matter." Elias gave a quick, shallow bow. "My apologies, Mr. Blackwood. I am a perfectionist. I trust I will not fail to meet your expectations this time." He spent the next hour working with a false sense of purpose, taking more pictures, his mind a whirlwind of fear and a grim sort of triumph. He had seen the truth. He had taken the pictures. He had the evidence he needed. He left the mansion, not with a sense of relief, but with a terrifying certainty that the game was just beginning. He had taken something from the lion's lair, and the lion would be coming for him. The air in Elias's studio was charged with a frantic energy. He worked with a feverish intensity, his hands moving with practiced speed and precision, but his mind a whirlwind of what he had just witnessed. He was no longer a methodical artist, he was an obsessed man driven by a terrible truth. He developed the plates from the secret room, the process feeling like an eternity. As the images began to form on the glass, a grim tableau of what he had seen in the mansion, his hands grew steady. He was now armed with the proof he needed. The first plate revealed the full image of the small, desolate room. The second, a close-up, showed the pile of clothes more clearly. They were a woman's clothes, Simple, worn, the kind a maid would wear. The third plate, however, was the one that sent a chill down his spine. It was a close-up of the floor, where the glint of silver had caught his eye. He held it up to the light, his magnifying glass pressed to the cold glass. The object was a small silver locket. Its surface was tarnished, but he could just make out a single, beautifully engraved letter, a C, Clara. The name seemed to echo in the silent studio. The locket Alistair had kept as a trophy on his watch chain was a twin to this one, a twisted memento of a crime. He moved to the fourth plate, a close-up of the large, heavy chest. The picture was slightly out of focus, a testament to his hurried, panicked movements. But he could make out something else. In the dark grain of the wood, just beneath the tarnished lock, was a series of long, faint scratch marks, as if something had been desperately trying to claw its way out. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. The mystery of Clara's disappearance wasn't a runaway girl, it was a confinement. It was a death. Alistair Blackwood hadn't just made her disappear, he had locked her away. Elias's hands trembled, not with fear, but with a righteous fury. He had found his proof. The photographs, the locket, the scratch marks, they were a silent witness to a crime that had been hidden for over a year. He packed the plates carefully, his mind already racing ahead. He needed to get these to Samuel. They had to act now, before Alistair realized what he had taken. He found Samuel at his usual table in the tavern, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Samuel's face was grim. "You were followed all day, Elias," he said, his voice a low growl. "Alistair is testing you. He knows you're up to something." Elias didn't respond. He simply laid the plates on the table, face down. "I have it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The proof. Everything." Samuel's cynicism seemed to vanish. He took the plates and held them up to the dim light of the tavern. He looked at the locket, at the chest, at the scratch marks. His eyes widened, and a slow, grim expression settled on his face. He looked at Elias, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a cold, hard understanding. "My God," he breathed. He kept her. He actually kept her. Elias told him everything, the forced door, the desolate room, the locket. He also told him about Eleanor's silent look, her veiled message, and the hope she had given him. "She's the key," Samuel said, his voice low and serious. "She's the only one who can confirm this. She's the only one who can lead us to the documents that Thomas Price hid. The police will need more than just these photographs. They'll say you broke into a rich man's house and made up a story." Elias nodded, the realization settling in his own mind. He had the photos, but he needed a voice. He needed a witness, and that witness was a frightened, silenced woman trapped in a gilded cage. "We need to get to her," Elias said. "We need to let her know that we're trying to help. We need a way to communicate with her without Alistair knowing." They spent the next few hours meticulously planning their next move. A letter would be too dangerous, too easily intercepted. They had to come up with a message so subtle, so innocuous, that it would pass right under Alistair's nose. Elias, ever the artist, had an idea. He would send her a new glass plate, a blank one, with a simple, almost invisible etching on the back. It would be a signal, a proof of his knowledge and his intent. The message was a simple, 3-word etching on the back of the plate, visible only to a trained eye. Clara. Locket. Help. He had to believe that she was as desperate for the truth to come out as he was. They sent the package by a neutral courier, and then they waited. The days that followed were a torturous, nerve-wracking existence. Elias felt like a hunter who had just wounded a very large, very dangerous animal. He knew Alistair was out there, watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. The confirmation of this came a few days later. He returned to his studio to find his front window shattered, a single jagged shard of glass from his own lens lying on his desk. And on the shard, the same scrawled note, "Final warning." Elias was filled with a cold, righteous rage. He was not a detective, not a man of violence. He was a photographer. But he had seen the secrets behind a polished facade, and he had a moral obligation to expose them. He would not stop. He would not be silenced. He would wait, and he would see if Eleanor had found the courage to fight back. The shattered window was a final, emphatic warning. It wasn't just a message. It was a physical breach of his sanctuary, a declaration of Alistair Blackwood's power and his reach. But it did not instill fear in Elias. It hardened his resolve. He felt a grim sort of freedom. He had crossed a line and there was no going back. He was now a player in Alistair's game, but with a purpose that Alistair could not comprehend. The pursuit of truth. Days turned into a week, and there was no response from Eleanor. Elias was on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder, his sleep haunted by the image of the chest and the dark stain on its wood. The silence from the mansion was unnerving. He and Samuel had done their part. They had sent the message. Now, all they could do was wait and hope that their cryptic signal had been received and, more importantly, understood. He was beginning to lose hope, to wonder if Eleanor was too terrified to act, or if she had been intercepted. He was sitting in his studio, the gas lamp casting long shadows, when a timid knock sounded on his door. His hand instinctively went for a small, heavy paperweight on his desk. He opened the door a crack, his heart pounding in his chest. Standing on his stoop was a young servant girl no older than 15, her face pale with fright. She held a small, folded piece of paper in her hand. "I was told to give this to you," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "From Mrs. Blackwood. She said to tell you. The locket." Elias's breath hitched. The locket. The code word. She had understood. He took the note, his hands shaking, and the girl disappeared into the night as if she were a ghost. He locked the door behind him and unfolded the note. It was not a message of great detail. It was simple and to the point. St. Patrick's, Sunday, 3 p.m., alone. The instructions were clear. St. Patrick's Cathedral, a new, massive building under construction that dominated the city skyline, was a place of public gathering, but also of solemn silence and solitude. It was a perfect place for a secret rendezvous. But the final instruction, alone, was a heavy one. Elias knew this could be a trap. Alistair could have discovered Eleanor's plan, and this meeting could be a ruse to lure him into an ambush. But he had to take the risk. He had to trust her. He told Samuel of the meeting, and Samuel, ever the pragmatist, was worried. "Elias, this is a terrible idea. You don't know what you're walking into. She could be leading you to your death. Let me go with you. I'll keep my distance, but I'll be there." "No," Elias said, his voice firm. She said alone, "I have to trust her. This is her chance. If she senses any deception, she will withdraw. This is between her and me. I'm the one who started it. I have to see it through." Sunday was a crisp, clear day, the cold air a shock to his lungs. Elias walked the long miles to the cathedral, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. He arrived a few minutes early and waited in the cavernous, half-finished nave. The high arches and unadorned stone walls created a sense of solemn, almost sacred purpose. He saw her from a distance. Eleanor Blackwood, in a simple dark dress, a veiled hat obscuring most of her face. She was not the same woman he had photographed. The icy composure had melted away, replaced by a desperate vulnerability. She was no longer a silent object of desire. She was a woman on the brink. She walked towards him, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. When she stood before him, she did not look at him directly. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, as if she were afraid to meet his eyes. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice a soft, breathless whisper. "I have been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." He didn't say anything. He just listened. And she began to tell him her story, her voice filled with a tremor that was not of fear, but of a quiet, burning rage. She told him about Alistair's first wife, a woman she had served as a companion, who had slowly withered under Alistair's controlling and cruel hand. She had died of a mysterious illness, a wasting sickness, as the doctors had called it. But Eleanor knew it was from a broken spirit. She had a small secret diary in which she had written her final thoughts, a desperate plea for Eleanor to expose him. Eleanor confessed that Alistair had used the diary to blackmail her, threatening to expose her family's financial ruin and a dark secret from their past if she did not marry him. The marriage, she said, was not a union of love, but a contract of control. She then spoke of Clara. She had noticed Alistair's strange obsession with the girl, his possessive gaze. She had seen him follow her, watch her. One night, she had stumbled upon a scene that haunted her dreams. She had seen Alistair, in a fit of rage, strike Clara. Clara had been smart, though. She had been putting together proof of his crimes, finding the ledgers and documents that Thomas Price had hidden. She had told Eleanor she was going to expose him, but Alistair had found out. Eleanor had heard the screams from the secret room, the sound of the key turning in the lock. She had heard nothing since. "He keeps her locket," Eleanor said, her voice a near silent sob. "It is a trophy, a symbol of his power. He kept the locket and he kept the hair. He said he would show it to anyone who dared to question him. He is a monster, Mr. Thorne, a man without a soul." Elias's hands balled into fists. The story was more horrifying than he had ever imagined. The locket was not just a symbol of control, it was a physical manifestation of a cold-blooded murder. Eleanor then told him the most important part of her story. She had found the documents that Clara had hidden, the same documents Thomas Price had spoken of. She had them hidden, waiting for the right person to take them and expose the monster she had been forced to marry. She told him the key to the chest was in a secret compartment in the family's ancestral clock. She told him where the documents were hidden. "I will create a diversion," she said, her eyes now burning with a cold, clear resolve. "I will make him leave the mansion for a few hours. I will not live in fear anymore. But you must come, and you must find what is there. It is the only way to expose him, for Clara, for his first wife, for me." Elias looked at her, and he saw a woman reborn. She was no longer a victim, she was a silent warrior. He nodded. "I will," he said, his voice a promise. "I will." The game was on, and this time they had an inside man. The plan was a symphony of precision and deception, a ballet of calculated risks. With the information from Eleanor, Elias and Samuel worked in a frantic, focused energy. They contacted a trusted friend, a retired police officer named William, a man of quiet integrity who had left the force due to its rampant corruption. He was skeptical at first, but when Elias showed him the photographs and shared Eleanor's harrowing testimony, his cynicism turned into a quiet, burning fury. "That monster," William said, his voice low and dangerous. "I knew there was something wrong with that Thomas Price case. I knew it. Alistair Blackwood has always been a master of manipulation. He owns this city, Thorne." Elias nodded. "Then we'll have to take him down with proof he can't buy or talk his way out of." The day of the plan was a beautiful, crisp fall afternoon, a stark contrast to the ugliness of the truth they were about to expose. Eleanor's plan was to create a public scene at a high society charity event Alistair was hosting. She would orchestrate a dramatic and seemingly public breakdown, a hysterical fit of despair that would draw all of his attention. It would be a calculated risk, but a necessary one. Eleanor's acting was a chilling testament to her desperation. As Alistair was giving a speech to his wealthy friends and business partners, Eleanor collapsed, her screams echoing through the opulent ballroom. The guests were in a state of shock, but Alistair's reaction was one of pure, unadulterated rage. He was a man who prized his image above all else, and Eleanor's public display was a mortal blow to his carefully constructed facade. He rushed her out of the event, his face a mask of fury, a visible crack in his carefully curated veneer of respectability. He would take her back to the mansion, where he would keep her locked away from prying eyes. This was their opportunity. Elias and Samuel, dressed in dark, unassuming clothes, made their way to the mansion. They approached it from the back, slipping through the quiet streets like ghosts. The usual surveillance was gone, Alistair's enforcers likely having gone to the event. The house was quiet, a perfect silent monument to a man's dark secrets. Using the small cryptic diagram from Eleanor, they found a small hidden entrance on the side of the house, a service door that was rarely used. Elias, a man of patience and meticulousness, picked the lock with a small set of tools he had prepared. The door clicked open with a soft, ominous sound, and they slipped inside. The mansion, without the pretense of life and light, felt like a tomb. They made their way to Alistair's study, a room of dark mahogany and leather-bound books. They found the large, imposing grandfather clock, a relic that seemed to have been a silent witness to 1,000 dark conversations. Elias and Samuel worked together, using the diagram to find the hidden compartment. It was a small panel on the back of the clock, almost invisible. A secret only someone who had lived with it for years would have known. Inside, they found a small key, old and rusted, but polished with a faint sheen. It was the key to the chest. With the key in their possession, they moved to the secret room, the same door Elias had forced open just a week before. The door opened with a slow, agonizing creak. The room was dark, the only light from their small lantern. They found the chest in the corner, the same chest from the photograph. Its surface was cold and hard, a coffin for a lie. Elias, with a trembling hand, inserted the key into the lock. The lock clicked, and the chest opened with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the mansion. Inside, they found not only a human skeleton, its bones small and fragile, but a series of documents bundled together and sealed with wax. A small, black leather-bound journal was placed on top of them. The journal belonged to Alistair's first wife. Elias's hands trembled as he opened it. The last entry, dated just before her death, was a desperate plea to Eleanor, a confession of Alistair's systematic psychological abuse, and a plea to expose him. He had not killed her with his hands, he had killed her with his soul. The other documents were even more damning. They were Alistair's personal ledgers, detailing every single one of his illegal land deals, his extortion of his business partners, and, in a final horrifying entry, a detailed account of Thomas Price's murder and his meticulous record of Clara's confinement. He was a sociopath, a man who saw other people not as human beings, but as objects to be used, manipulated, and discarded. The final twist. Alistair hadn't just murdered Clara, he had driven his first wife to her death with his cruelty. And then he'd used her last wishes to trap Eleanor. He was a collector of broken souls, and he had documented every single one. Elias and Samuel, their faces grim, carefully gathered the documents. They had everything. The photographs, the journal, the ledgers, the body in the chest. A mountain of undeniable proof. The monster in the mansion, the man in the perfect portrait, would finally be exposed. They had seen his soul, and it was a barren, terrifying wasteland. They left the mansion, leaving the chest open, a silent testament to the horrors they had just witnessed. The final act unfolded with a chilling inevitability. Elias and Samuel presented the evidence to William, the retired police officer. He, in turn, contacted a handful of trusted men from his old precinct, officers of integrity who had chafed under Alistair Blackwood's influence. They were a small but determined group. The next morning, as the city awoke, an official warrant was issued for the arrest of Alistair Blackwood. It was a bold move, a seismic event in the city's power structure. Alistair was at the Blackwood mansion, tending to his now hysterical wife, when the police arrived. He was shocked, his perfect composure shattering like glass. He blustered, he threatened, he demanded to know who was behind this outrage. "The evidence is overwhelming, Mr. Blackwood," William said, his voice flat, emotionless. "The remains of a maid named Clara, the ledgers of your illegal dealings, and a confession in your late wife's journal detailing your cruelty. The jig is up." Alistair's gaze, a final cold fire of hatred, fell on Elias. He stood in the shadows behind the police, a silent witness. Alistair saw him, and in that moment, the veneer of the confident, powerful man vanished, revealing the feral rage of a cornered animal. He lunged at Elias, but the police held him back, wrestling him into submission. His screams echoed in the grand halls, a final, public humiliation. The perfect portrait had been shattered. The news of Alistair Blackwood's arrest rocked the city. The newspapers, finally free to report the truth, splashed the sordid details across their front pages. The stories of Thomas Price, Clara and Alistair's first wife, were no longer footnotes in history. They were a terrifying saga, a cautionary tale about the darkness that could reside behind the most respectable of facades. The city was finally able to see the monster in its midst, and it was a truth so horrifying that it would be whispered for generations. Eleanor, now a free woman, was taken into protective custody. She was a key witness, her testimony sealing Alistair's fate. She was no longer a beautiful, silent object. She was a survivor. She had finally broken free from her gilded cage, and with a quiet dignity, she began to reclaim her life. She would not remain in New York. The memories were too painful. She would start a new life in a small town, far away from the shadows of Fifth Avenue. Elias, for his part, was a changed man. The terror, the obsession, the long nights of his investigation had not broken him. They had reshaped him. He was no longer a man who hid in the quiet sanctuary of his studio. He had faced his fears and had emerged with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just a photographer of surfaces. He was a seeker of truth. The photograph that had started it all, the portrait of Alistair and Eleanor, a testament to a perfect union, now hung on the wall of his studio, a silent sentinel. It was no longer a symbol of a beautiful lie. It was a reminder of a terrifying truth. A testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound horrors are not in the supernatural, but in the depths of the human heart. He no longer saw the world through a lens of quiet observation. He saw it through a lens of profound empathy and understanding. He saw the cracks in the perfect veneers, the silent struggles in the eyes of his subjects, the hidden stories that waited to be told. The trauma of the past had given him a purpose, a new kind of art. He would continue to take portraits, but now he would not just capture a likeness. He would capture a soul. He would not just photograph a smile. He would photograph the truth. And in a world filled with lies, that was the most powerful thing of all. The story was over, but a new life had just begun.